Lost in the American mythology of the Mayflower is a central question. How did a group of disenfranchised religious separatists finance a large ship, pay an experienced crew, and provision for a year's worth of supplies on the way to the New World? Even for sovereign authorities of the early 17th century, outfitting a transatlantic voyage was no small financial undertaking. Certainly, impoverished political refugees of today, when crossing oceans, do not do so in chartered transportation or arrive with any capacity for financial sustenance. The financial story behind this journey points to a parallel narrative, one in which the exalted sentiments of religious liberty found themselves subordinated to economic considerations and motivations. In 1616, the group that history would later call the Pilgrims was an exiled community of religious separatists living in Holland. The original members of this community had fled England in 1608, first settling in Amsterdam for a few years before making their way inland to the city of Leiden. In William Bradford's first-hand account of their time in Leiden, while considering it a fair and beautiful city, the separatists were largely limited to employment that required hard and continual labor, many in the cloth-making trades. While the full and open practice of its brand of Christianity was prohibited in England, the congregation was relatively free of persecution in Holland. Indeed, one account held that local Dutch merchants viewed their piety as a mark of creditworthiness, despite their relatively low economic standing. After 12 years of living in Holland, while some observed potential risks to religious freedom, the congregation began searching for alternatives primarily to improve their economic condition. For the congregation, the initial impetus for leaving England for Holland had been to settle well and attract additional members of the church to join them. But the hard toil and great labor of the pioneers in Leiden proved a sufficient deterrent to these potential émigrés. To Bradford, it was clear that some preferred and chose the prisons in England rather than this liberty in Holland with these afflictions. In addition, the older members were beginning to die, with this fate often coming earlier due to the grueling work. At the same time, the congregants' children, to bear part of their parents' burden, were forced to work in conditions similar to their elders. If all this weren't bad enough, the manifold temptations of Holland had drawn the older children as they entered adulthood into extravagant courses, away from the church, with the degenerating behavior risking dishonor to God. It became clear to the community elders that without growth of the congregation, the experiment would likely dissipate within a generation into secular Dutch society and end quietly. In all, it seemed that challenging economic circumstances more than persecution presented the greatest danger to their religious fundamentalism. Again, the solution seemed to be relocation. Early thoughts veered to the vast and unpeopled countries of America. The idea sparked considerable internal debate, primarily focused on the speculative dangers of climate, savages, disease, famine, and nakedness of the natives. After these, another risk needed mitigation. The prospect of living in any proximity to Spanish holdings in the Americas was eliminated with the view that the Catholic Spaniards might prove as cruel as the savages in America. As most of the rest of America had been declared largely by England, and to a far lesser extent by Holland, this left two choices. Either possibility required negotiations and permission. The English possibility, of course, had a special irony. The group that had once fled England was now contemplating overtures to the same sovereignty that had once persecuted them. But this path was a circuitous one. Dating back to 1606, England had granted a charter to a private venture known as the Virginia Company of London. While the internal operations of the New World venture were left in the commercial hands of the company, there remained an element of oversight and governance in the king's hands, exercised through his Council for Virginia. Like most new ventures, overseas or otherwise, the Virginia Company had a less than auspicious start. In its first decade, It had lost all of its money several times and needed to be refinanced each time. Worse, the vast majority of the settlers sent overseas had met miserable deaths. A decade in, the Virginia Company was in a beleaguered state of affairs. When the Leiden congregation dispatched 2 men to London to explore the possibility of settling within its holdings, the company greeted them with the enthusiasm of a lonely merchant meeting the day's only customers. The profitability of Virginia as a commercial enterprise depended on viable settlements. Settlements needed people willing to risk life and limb. The desperation of the men from Holland coincided with that of the company. There remained an obstacle, however. The congregation wanted explicit permission to practice their religion. The commercially motivated men of the Virginia Company, optimistic in the face of opportunity, assured them in turn that the king's blessing for this minor provision would be perfunctory. It wasn't. The process dragged on. The council's position held that an official endorsement of the congregation's practices overseas would undermine His Majesty's ability to prohibit aspects of their practice in England. With the company serving as a conduit, a compromise was reached. The King's Council for Virginia would neither endorse nor prohibit their practices overseas, provided that the Leiden congregants acknowledged obedience to the king.